So protecting Maine water resources, we have Steve Coghlan from the University of Maine, Freshwater Ecologist, and he's going to lead us off. Thank you, Steve.
All right, can you hear me? Yes, all right, it's distracting here. Thanks very much. I apologize, I left my glasses in the car today, so hard to see. So I'm honored that you invited me to be here as your keynote speaker, and I see a few familiar faces in the crowd and some familiar names on the agenda, and I wanted to thank specifically, I see Ed Spencer over there, and there's Eric and a few others. But Ed and others introduced me to this Maine's activist circle a few years ago. So about 3 years ago, a proposal surfaced to build a dump in Argyle Township, which is my home, and these men and women sparked the resistance that ultimately stopped the dump and inspired me to get involved. So Ed and many others have been fighting for environmental and social justice and against landfills in Maine for many decades. They've set a great example of how a committed group of ordinary citizens can organize and affect meaningful change, especially when the established power structure opposes them at all costs. So they've shown that many Mainers share a vision of a just and equitable society that values and protects its environmental support systems. I'd also like to thank members of the Penobscot Indian Nation for their leadership and vision towards protecting and restoring the Penobscot River watershed to the benefit of all Mainers. And I value the wisdom and the insight and the foresight of my Indigenous friends and neighbors, and I think we should look to them first and foremost for guidance in charting a path towards sustainability. So Lou asked me here to speak about Maine's fisheries and aquatic ecosystems, and I'll get there in a minute. And then he said I could talk about anything I wanted, so I will. And I'll end with a more integrated big picture perspective on sustainability. But first, just tell you a bit about how I ended up here, because that's sort of, I think, interesting to my story. Originally, I enrolled in college to study finance, and I aspired to work as an investment banker on Wall Street. So clearly that didn't happen. The full story is too long to recount here, but eventually I abandoned business and finance. And I decided that streams and fish were my true passion, and I switched to ecology and environmental science. So I've always loved to fish, especially with a fly rod or through the ice, and I wanted to live and work in a place that had beautiful lakes and streams and wild or native trout and salmon populations. And more importantly, my ecological education in college improved my awareness of the unfolding environmental crises around me. It shaped my mental model of the future, and it forced me to think critically about sustainability. I anticipated, and still expect, a future of tremendous constraints imposed by peak fossil energy, climate change, and unpayable financial and ecological debt. I thought Maine would be a good place to make my stand and build a resilient, productive homestead that could weather disruptions. I thought a public university job would be a good place to work, provide a reliable income to fund investments in my homestead, and help me contribute to the common good through teaching, research, and here, public service. But eventually I landed my dream job in my dream location, a fisheries professor at the University of Maine. My wife and I live in Argyle Township with our dogs and cats. We try to produce as much of our own food as possible, raising livestock, gardening, hunting, fishing, foraging. Firewood from our woodlot heats our home, and solar panels provide about half of our electricity. I have no illusions about being self-sufficient or sustainable, but I'm trying to become more self-reliant, reduce my ecological footprint, and limit my dependence on the global industrialized economic system. And I've been pleasantly surprised to see that a lot of people here in Maine, especially rural Mainers, share my vision. So Maine's fortunate to have been endowed with valuable aquatic resources that have shaped our culture and driven our economy. Much of my current research focus is specifically on the Penobscot River watershed and its fisheries, but the same story would apply to most waters throughout the state. The Penobscot once supported incredible production of sea-run fish, like alewife and blueback herring, that sustained Native Americans, and directly or indirectly, just about every species of plant and animal within the watershed. Historic spawning runs probably exceeded tens of millions of fish, and in addition to millions of American shad and tens of thousands of Atlantic salmon, truly made the rivers run silver. Up-migrating adults transported energy and nutrients from the ocean into otherwise infertile streams and lakes, and down-migrating juveniles provided prey for marine predators like cod and seals. Other important fish included striped bass and sturgeons, sea lamprey, rainbow smelt, and brook trout. Intact forests and wetlands in the surrounding watershed produced clean, cold water required by species like salmon and trout, and buffered the effects of droughts and floods. Indigenous people lived sustainably on nature's bounty of fish and wildlife and other ecological goods and services for thousands of years. But you all know the story. Industrialization of our economy and associated exponential growth in human population, consumption, and pollution led to centuries of abuse. Dams were built, forests were cut, wetlands were filled, sewage and mill effluent were dumped. Fisheries were driven to collapse, and native people and wildlife were persecuted. Essentially, the watershed and its resources were treated as mere commodities that would and should be destroyed in the name of profit and economic growth. Thankfully, this perspective is changing. The Penobscot River Restoration Project provides a world-class example of holistic conservation effort designed to heal past ecological and cultural wounds inflicted by our industrial economy. The project has improved access to thousands of kilometers of historic spawning and nursery habitat for sea-run fish by removing 2 main stem dams and improving fish passage at others. Other projects in smaller streams have improved passage through poorly designed culverts and road crossings so that trout and salmon can access cold water refugia and headwater streams during summer droughts. So far, early results are promising, and I'm excited about the prospect of watching ecological recovery play out in my backyard in real time. Certainly, dam removal and habitat restoration aren't silver bullets or miracle cures, but they're necessary first steps to recover fisheries and their supporting ecosystems. Projects like these demonstrate that we humans can change our ways of thinking, learn from the past mistakes, and adopt systems-oriented approaches that acknowledge the complex interconnectedness of nature. We should continue to embrace such forward-thinking conservation approaches that strengthen ecological structure, function, resilience, so that natural systems can rebuild and sustain themselves. But even as I'm heartened by local efforts and achievements such as those in the Penobscot, I'm disheartened and even demoralized at our collective inability to address ecological crises and make meaningful progress towards sustainability. Global warming is the most obvious and consequential example, but many others exist. Industrialized human society is on a trajectory for catastrophic failure, and we seem to be doing everything in our power to ensure our legacy of destruction is felt across the globe and far into the future. Our failure arises, at least in part, from a fundamental misunderstanding or outright denial of our species' relationship with Earth. Humans are undoubtedly a part of nature, even though our dominant economic paradigm requires us to think and act as if we were separate from nature. Until we change our way of thinking, we have no hopes of achieving a sustainable society. So, we need to adopt a more realistic worldview to better understand how our economy relates to our environment and how that relationship in turn feeds back to affect society. Getting a little away from fisheries now. It should be based on scientific principles and consistent with the laws of nature. We can start back in 1971 with Barry Commoner's 4 laws of ecology that apply equally well to economics. First, everything is connected to everything else. There's one ecosystem for all life, and what affects one affects all. We could call this the law of complex ecological interdependence. Second, everything must go somewhere. There's no way to which we can throw our waste. This is essentially the first law of thermodynamics. Third, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Exploitation of nature converts resources from useful forms to waste. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And fourth, nature knows best. Humans have fashioned technology to improve upon nature, but effects on natural systems are almost always detrimental. We could restate this as the chief cause of problems are solutions. We should also consider Dr. Al Bartlett's 19 laws of sustainability. I won't go through all of them, but the first of which is a simple axiom. Growth in population and or rates of consumption cannot be sustained. So we need to view our economy for what it really is, a metabolic system embedded within the environment, generates wealth by eating resources and defecating waste. Metabolic processes are governed and constrained by biophysical laws and principles, thermodynamics, entropy, energy hierarchy, and so on. On our finite planet, there are limits to growth in the size, complexity, and performance of our economy that are set by resource availability, waste assimilation capacity, and this complex ecological interdependence that drives processes like nutrient recycling, topsoil formation, evolution of biodiversity, and climate regulation. For most of our 3 million years of evolutionary history, our species lived what could be called sustainable lifestyles, with population size set by carrying capacity of local ecosystems, and ultimately by the finite flows of solar energy that that fueled organic production and drove the hydrologic cycle. Fossil fuels gave humans access to millions of years of stored solar energy and allowed us to temporarily transcend local limits. Our power to perform economic work increased exponentially, as did our ability to exploit nature and each other. Fossil fuels allow us to exploit other resources faster than they can be replenished, liquidating stocks of natural capital and eroding future carrying capacity. Populations exploded, as did consumption and pollution. Wealth grew tremendously, as did the disparity between rich and poor. Our recent success as a species would not have been possible without it's quiet now. without the huge subsidies of cheap energy provided by fossil fuels, along with the seemingly unlimited capacity of Earth to receive our wastes. Ironically, economic theories emerged during industrialization that ignored energy, other natural resources, and ecological services because they were superabundant and cheap and could be ignored. Instead, economists attributed our good fortune and prospects for economic growth to the wisdom of markets, the genius of human intelligence and creativity, and the magic of technological innovation. For a variety of reasons, unfortunately, these theories are still with us today, forming the foundation of orthodox economic theory and canonizing our focus on growth. However, we can't trust this framework to identify environmental problems and promote intelligent responses. This framework views the economy as the whole entire system that has no boundaries. The environment either doesn't exist or it's viewed as some abstract entity that provides us with free and inexhaustible gifts. Economic activity is reduced to circular flows of abstract exchange values through self-regulating markets. Factors of production are completely substitutable, so depletion of resources is of no consequence, and absolute scarcity is not possible. Essentially, this model is a perpetual motion machine that violates the laws of thermodynamics. It requires no energy or material inputs. It produces no wastes. It can grow without limits and faces no external constraints, equivalent to a car that runs ever faster on its own exhaust, or an animal that grows ever larger by feeding on its own waste. This economic model is a dangerous fallacy. It requires us to suspend disbelief and accept its assumptions as articles of faith, even though we know those assumptions contradict reality and the laws of nature. It assures us that wealth will eventually trickle down from rich to poor. It rationalizes destruction of nature and promotes the pathological pursuit of profit above all else. It seduces us with its promises that all good things flow from growth. Arguments encouraging more growth in the hopes of enlarging our economic pie distract us from the fact that the pie is sliced so inequitably to begin with, and ultimately, the pie can only be so large. Arguments that a rising economic tide lifts all boats ignores the fact that boats vary greatly in their size and their seaworthiness, and the wakes from luxury yachts can swamp dinghies and those people who don't have boats and are barely treading water. Growth for growth's sake is not a rational policy. It does not provide the means to desirable ends, especially for already affluent societies, and in the long run is suicidal because it encourages destruction of the Earth's finite resource base and most non-human life as rapidly as possible. We need only look around us to see the real-world implications of adherence to this economic model. So, in practice and reality, our high-powered industrialized economy run according to these principles operates as a supercharged externalizing machine driven to maximize short-term profit at the expense of long-term sustainability and eventually destined to deplete its resource base and destroy its environment. Benefits accrue disproportionately to the rich and powerful, while costs are loaded onto the poor and powerless, especially those out of sight in faraway lands, onto future generations, other living creatures, or onto entire social and ecological systems who can't protest or object. Value is determined solely in markets, so resources and services provided freely by nature are deemed worthless, and discounting the future encourages rampant exploitation now. Our entire infrastructure for feeding our population, generating wealth, and maintaining societal complexity depends on continued access to cheap and abundant fossil fuels, even as these fuels deplete and we choke on their exhaust. Our financial and monetary systems create money out of thin air through debt, mandating that the entire economic system must grow perpetually to keep financing that debt or risk collapse. Almost there, 2 more pages. Perhaps previous generations can be forgiven for failing to see the consequences of pursuing limitless economic growth on a finite planet, because in part, the system perpetuates itself by obscuring the relation between humans and nature. But there is no excuse now. Scientific evidence is clear that our levels of consumption and pollution are not sustainable. The world is overpopulated, the climate is changing more rapidly than scientists predicted even just a decade ago. Renewable resources like fisheries and the ecosystems supporting them are collapsing around the globe, and we're consuming resources and producing waste beyond the regenerative capacity of the biosphere. Ecological footprint analysis reveals that to sustain our energy and waste-intensive lifestyle, we would require 3 Earths, but we only have 1. We've overshot Earth's carrying capacity, and our window to respond to a collapsing biosphere, adapt to a destabilizing climate, and transition to resilient local economies is closing rapidly. We're at a tipping point, and we need rational, scientifically informed environmental policy at all levels of society and government to guide us towards sustainability now. We need to embrace actions that slow, then reverse population and economic growth. Eventually, we must transition to a steady-state economy in which humans live within nature's means, consuming no more than nature can replenish, and wasting no more than nature can assimilate. Our current economic system can't be sustained, and left to its own devices will eventually destroy itself and possibly our entire environmental support system with it. It is in our best interest to move quickly to replace it on our terms. Without a managed transition towards a steady-state economy, nature will force an end to growth on its terms, not ours. Fortunately, policy frameworks for adapting to our economic reality exist, and there's plenty of work that we can get started on immediately. I'm heartened by the fact that here in Maine, many of us, many of you, have already been discussing and even implementing these ideas. Rather than describe them now, I encourage you to check out the Center for Advancement of the Steady State Economy website, CASI, and full disclosure, I'm director of the Maine chapter, and I'm sure we're going to hear more details in later talks. So finally, this is the last paragraph, I'm going to do something that I never do, but I'm doing it today. We are in the Capitol building, and I'm going to end on a political and personal note. I take great care to separate my scientific perspective from my views as a citizen, and I think I usually do a good job, but I like to think that the former informs the latter. So here goes. Seems to me that we're witnessing a hostile corporate takeover, first of the US government and eventually of planet Earth. The Trump administration and a complicit congressional majority appear to be forcing us into a murder-suicide pact with our environment. Every single political or policy act has taken us in exactly the wrong direction, worsening our environmental crises and making us more vulnerable to catastrophe. Government and society should be mobilizing to address the challenges I described above, not shoveling fuel into a runaway train. We don't have enough ecological breathing room to make any more mistakes, and we're running out of time to change course. We can't let the ruling kleptocracy drain our planet of its remaining wealth to wring out just a little more growth and perpetuate the illusion that all is well. I fear that this is planet Earth's last stand, and we must fight the Trump administration and its enablers as if our homes and lives depended on it, because they do. I'm optimistic that many of you share this sentiment, and I look forward to joining you in the fight. Thank you very much.